which speaks of love, a subject which always gives pleasure, for a tale without love is like beef without mustard, an insipid dish. Nothing ever astonished Maurice. He never sought to know the causes of things and dwelt tranquilly in the world of appearances. Not denying the eternal truth, he nevertheless followed vain things as his fancy led him. Less addicted to sport and violent exercise than most young people of his generation, he followed unconsciously the old erotic traditions of his race. The French were ever the most gallant of men, and it were a pity they should lose this advantage. Maurice preserved it. He was in love with no woman, but, as St. Augustine said, he loved to love. After paying the tribute that was rightly due to the imperishable beauty and secret arts of Madame de la Berthelière, he had enjoyed the impetuous caresses of a young singer called Luciole. At present he was joylessly experiencing the primitive perversity of Odile, his mother's lady's maid, and the tearful adoration of the beautiful Madame Boidier. And he felt a great void in his heart. It chanced that one Wednesday, on entering the drawing-room where his mother entertained her friends, who were, generally speaking, unattractive and austere ladies, with a sprinkling of old men and very young people, he noticed, in this intimate circle, Madame d'Albals, the wife of the magistrate at the law courts, whom Monsieur d'Esparvieu had vainly consulted on the mysterious ransacking of his library. She was young, he found her pretty, and not without cause. Gilbert had been modeled by the genius of the race, and no other genius had had a part in the work. Thus all her attributes inspired desire, and nothing in her shape or her being aroused any other sentiment. The law of attraction which draws world to world moved young Maurice to approach this delicious creature, and under its influence he offered to escort her to the tea-table. And when Gilbert was served with tea, he said, "We should hit it off quite well together, you and I, don't you think?" He spoke in this way, according to modern usage, so as to avoid inane compliments and to spare a woman the boredom of listening to one of those old declarations of love which, containing nothing but what is vague and undefined, require neither a truthful nor an exact reply. And profiting by the fact that he had an opportunity of conversing secretly with Madame d'Albals for a few minutes, he spoke urgently and to the point. Gilbert, so far as one could judge, was made rather to awaken desire than to feel it. Nevertheless, she well knew that her fate was to love, and she followed it willingly and with pleasure. Maurice did not particularly displease her. She would have preferred him to be an orphan, for experience had taught her how disappointing it sometimes is to love the son of the house. "Will you?" he said by way of conclusion. She pretended not to understand, and with her little foie gras sandwich raised halfway to her mouth she looked at Maurice with wondering eyes. "Will I what?" she asked. "You know quite well." Madame d'Albals lowered her eyes, and sipped her tea, for her prudishness was not quite vanquished. Meanwhile Maurice, taking her empty cup from her hand, murmured, "Saturday, 5 o'clock, 126 Rue de Rome, on the ground floor, the door on the right, under the arch, knock 3 times. Madame d'Albals glanced severely and imperturbably at the son of the house, and with a self-possessed air rejoined the circle of highly respectable women to whom the Senator Monsieur Lafall was explaining how artificial incubators were employed at the agricultural colony at Saint Julien. The following Saturday, Maurice, in his ground-floor flat, awaited Madame d'Albals. He waited her in vain. No light hand came to knock 3 times on the door under the arch. And Maurice gave way to imprecation, inwardly calling the absent one a jade and a hussy. His fruitless wait, his frustrated desires, rendered him unjust. For Madame d'Albals in not coming where she had never promised to go hardly deserved these names, but we judge human actions by the pleasure or pain they cause us. Maurice did not put in an appearance in his mother's drawing-room until a fortnight after the conversation at the tea-table. He came late. Madame d'Albals had been there for half an hour. He bowed coldly to her, took a seat some way off, and affected to be listening to the talk. Worthily matched, a rich male voice was saying, the two antagonists were well calculated to render the struggle a terrible and uncertain one. General Bull, with unprecedented tenacity, maintained his position as though he were rooted in the very soil. General Millepertuis, with an agility truly superhuman, kept carrying out movements of the most dazzling rapidity around his immovable adversary. The battle continued to be waged with terrible stubbornness. We were all in an agony of suspense. It was General d'Esparvieu describing the autumn maneuvers to a company of breathlessly interested ladies. He was talking well and his audience were delighted. Proceeding to draw a comparison between the French and German methods, he defined their distinguishing characteristics and brought out the conspicuous merits of both with a lofty impartiality. He did not hesitate to affirm that each system had its advantages, and at first made it appear to his circle of wondering, disappointed, and anxious dames, whose countenances were growing increasingly gloomy, that France and Germany were practically in a position of equality. But little by little, as the strategist went on to give a clearer definition of the two methods, that of the French began to appear flexible, elegant, vigorous, full of grace, cleverness, and verve, that of the Germans heavy, clumsy, and undecided. And slowly and surely the faces of the ladies began to clear and to light up with joyous smiles. In order to dissipate any lingering shadows of misgiving from the minds of these wives, sisters, and sweethearts, the general gave them to understand that we were in a position to make use of the German method when it suited us, but that the Germans could not avail themselves of the French method. No sooner had he delivered himself of these sentiments than he was buttonholed by Monsieur Le Truc de Ruffic, who was engaged in founding a patriotic society known as Swordsmanol, of which the object was to regenerate France and ensure her superiority over all her adversaries. Even children in the cradle were to be enrolled, and Monsieur Le Truc de Ruffic offered the honorary presidency to General d'Esparvieu. Meanwhile Maurice was appearing to be interested in a conversation that was taking place between a very gentle old lady and the Abbé La Petite, chaplain to the Dames du Saint-Sang. The old lady, severely tried of late by illness and the loss of friends, wanted to know how it was that people were unhappy in this world. How, she asked Abbé La Petite, do you explain the scourges that afflict mankind? Why are there plagues, famines, floods, and earthquakes? It is surely necessary that God should sometimes remind us of his existence, replied Abbé La Petite, with a heavenly smile. Maurice appeared keenly interested in this conversation. Then he seemed fascinated by Madame Philip Grandin, quite a personable young woman, whose simple innocence, however, detracted all piquancy from her beauty, all savor from her bodily charms. A very sour, shrill-voiced old lady who, affecting the dowdy, woolen weeds of poverty, displayed the pride of a great lady in the world of Christian finance, exclaimed in a squeaky voice, "Well, my dear Madame d'Esparvieu, so you have had trouble here. The papers speak darkly of robbery, of thefts committed in Monsieur d'Esparvieu's valuable library, of stolen letters?" "Oh," said Madame d'Esparvieu, "if we are to believe all the newspapers say." "Oh, so, dear madam, you have got your treasures back. All's well that ends well." "The library is in perfect order," asserted Madame d'Esparvieu. "There is nothing missing." "The library is on the floor above this, is it not?" asked young Madame d'Aubels, showing an unexpected interest in the books. Madame d'Esparvieu replied that the library occupied the whole of the second floor, and that they had put the least valuable books in the attics. "Could I not go and look at it?" The mistress of the house declared that nothing could be easier. She called to her son, "Maurice, go and do the honors of the library to Madame d'Aubels." Maurice rose, and without uttering a word, mounted to the second floor in the wake of Madame d'Aubels. He appeared indifferent, but inwardly he rejoiced, for he had no doubt that Gilbert had feigned her ardent desire to inspect the library simply to see him in secret. And, while affecting indifference, he promised himself to renew those offers which, this time, would not be refused. Under the romantic bust of Alexander d'Esparvieu, they were met by the silent shadow of a little wan, hollow-eyed old man, who wore a settled expression of mute terror. "Do not let us disturb you, Monsieur Sariette," said Maurice. "I am showing Madame d'Albals round the library." Maurice and Madame d'Albals passed on into the great room where against the four walls rose presses filled with books and surmounted by bronze busts of poets, philosophers, and orators of antiquity. All was in perfect order, an order which seemed never to have been disturbed from the beginning of things. Only, a black void was to be seen in the place which, only the evening before, had been filled by an unpublished manuscript of Richard Simon. Meanwhile, by the side of the young couple walked Monsieur Sariette, pale, faded, and silent. "Really and truly, you have not been nice," said Maurice, with a look of reproach at Madame d'Albals. She signed to him that the librarian might overhear. But he reassured her. "Take no notice. It is old Sariette. He has become a complete idiot." And he repeated, "No, you have not been at all nice. I awaited you. You did not come. You have made me unhappy." After a moment's silence, while one heard the low melancholy whistling of asthma in poor Sariette's bronchial tubes, young Maurice continued insistently. "You are wrong." "Why wrong?" "Wrong not to do as I ask you." "Do you still think so?" "Certainly." "You meant it seriously?" "As seriously as can be." Touched by his assurance of sincere and constant feeling, and thinking she had resisted sufficiently, Gilbert granted to Maurice what she had refused him a fortnight ago. They slipped into an embrasure of the window, behind an enormous celestial globe whereon were graven the signs of the zodiac and the figures of the stars, and there, their gaze fixed on the lion, the virgin, and the scales, in the presence of a multitude of Bibles, before the works of the Fathers, both Greek and Latin, beneath the casts of Homer, Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides, Herodotus, Thucydides, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, Demosthenes, Cicero, Virgil, Horace, Seneca, and Epictetus, they exchanged vows of love and a long kiss on the mouth. Almost immediately Madame d'Albals bethought herself that she still had some calls to pay, and that she must make her escape quickly, for love had not made her lose all sense of her own importance. But she had barely crossed the landing with Maurice when they heard a hoarse cry and saw Monsieur Sariette plunge madly downstairs, exclaiming as he went, "Stop it, I saw it fly away. It escaped from the shelf by itself. It crossed the room, there it is, there. It's going downstairs. Stop it. It has gone out of the door on the ground floor." "What?" asked Maurice. Monsieur Sariette looked out of the landing window, murmuring horror-struck. "It's crossing the garden. It's going into the summer-house. Stop it. "But what is it?" repeated Maurice, "in God's name, what is it?" "My Flavius Josephus," exclaimed Monsieur Sariette. "Stop it." And he fell down unconscious. "You see he is quite mad," said Maurice to Madame d'Albals, as he lifted up the unfortunate librarian. Gilbert, a little pale, said she also thought she had seen something in the direction indicated by the unhappy man, something flying. Maurice had seen nothing, but he had felt what seemed like a gust of wind. He left Monsieur Sariette in the arms of Hippolyte and the housekeeper, who had both hastened to the spot on hearing the noise. The old gentleman had a wound in his head. "All the better," said the housekeeper, this wound may save him from having a fit. Madame d'Aubels gave her handkerchief to stop the blood, and recommended an arnica compress.